what's up? You guys might know me as Aces Track from Instagram. I wanted to come to talk to you guys today about some technical things regarding racing. I asked on my Instagram if anyone would be interested in some technical details that I apply to my racing, and I got some good feedback. So today I want to talk to you guys about power bands. So that's related to horsepower and torque, and how we can use dynos, for example, to figure out what our power bands are looking like. And then a little bit later, I'll break down a race between some local cars and see what improvements were made to the race, because there are actually two races. The first race is their heads-up run, and then after that, both tuners made some adjustments and they reran. And I want to go over what specific adjustments they made and how they might have saw some deficiencies and how they made them. And I think a lot of it stems from this power band analysis that we're about to cover. So first, let me just cover this technical stuff and then we'll get into the racing. So this is the dyno curve from a VMP blower Mustang. I believe it's on 93. That's why the horsepower is only 626 and 538 torque. What I really want to focus on today is the power band aspect. So I'm sure most of you guys understand that power is just a function of torque, and that to get power from torque, all you got to do is multiply torque times RPM and a constant, and then you get horsepower. So hopefully it makes sense to you if you were to increase torque in a certain range. So for example, if we were to keep this line going and extending further out here, let me actually pull up a marker. If we were to keep this line and extend it further like this torque line, that means this power curve would go up as well. So you can understand why increasing torque ultimately will increase horsepower. Okay, so how can we take this graph and learn some things about how our car will perform? Well, a lot of you guys probably hear people talk about power and torque, and most of the time those people are saying peak horsepower and peak torque. For some reason, I have no idea why that's the dominant way to speak about power and torque, but that's just not a good way to talk about it. It should always be in terms of average horsepower, because that's how you will be racing. That's how the car will be performing, in terms of average horsepower. Your car isn't at 1 RPM for the entirety of the race. You're going to be racing from a band, right? RPM band. So that's where your power band comes from. For example, this Mustang, let's say it's a 6R80, a 6-speed, okay? Usually that's going to mean that they're going to be starting around, let's say from a 60 roll, they're probably going to be in second gear from like a 5,500 RPM, and then by the time they shift, they're going to be around 7,500. And so that is their RPM band. The average power throughout that RPM is going to be the horsepower that they're going to be putting to the ground throughout the entirety of the race. So for example, they're in second gear, they rev 7,500, shift, it's going to drop back down, let's say around this 55 to 6,000 range. It's going to rev again all the way until they're done with the race. So throughout that entirety, you're going to get an average horsepower. That's going to be the power delivery for the car. Okay, so let's say we have another car, and I'll use a Century for example, because Centuries have different power bands, just like turbo cars. And of course, everyone always asks, what's the best power adder? There's different advantages and disadvantages for each power adder, but let's give an example here of a Century power band with the same torque and the same max power. Okay, it's going to be pretty flat and probably peak around the end of the RPM curve as expected. And so the corresponding horsepower curve, well, of course, as you know, the torque curve is lower, so that means the horsepower it makes at the same RPM is going to be lower. But remember, peak torque is the same. If these two numbers were to be the only thing I'd report out, this torque number would be the same right here. Okay, so technically it should cross at the same line, but whatever. Okay. This particular Century car, for example, has the same horsepower and the same torque as the blower car. However, considering if everything else is the same, the only difference is that they have these power bands. The blower car will win, and that is objectively true, and that is because of the difference in power for the RPM band, not peak horsepower and peak torque. Again, these cars make the same exact 626, 540 horsepower and torque, but notice how the blower car has a lot more power at different points of the RPM band. That will mean that it will be a faster car at those RPMs, and that's what we race at, correct? So throughout the race, this car will be making more power, probably jump out on the blue car here. And over time, yes, they will be making the same power. So in theory, for a split second, the red car shouldn't be pulling on the blue car anymore. But right when they shift, the same thing happens again, right? This car is making more power at this RPM. This is why Sentry cars struggle performing to the same level as other cars, because most of the time they're reporting peak numbers, but their average number, which is what we care about, area under the curve, same thing, is much lower than the average of the other car, this VMP car. So for example, this lower car is averaging close to 600 horsepower throughout the entire RPM band, and that's really powerful. However, if you notice the Sentry car in this circumstance, it's averaging closer to, let's say, 5 or 550 horsepower, because it doesn't hit its peak power until the very end. So that doesn't help its cause, right? You want to be making as much power as quickly as possible. Okay, so let me cover one more power band, and that's the turbo power band. So usually they're going to start off also lower. They're going to spike here. They're going to spike there, and then carry out like this. Okay, so again, similar torque, right? Same torque, but I can't draw. Okay, similar torque, but as this particular turbo car makes more torque at the same RPM later on, same peak torque, but look, it's going to make more torque over here. So what does that mean? Horsepower will be higher at that RPM band. In fact, this car ultimately would probably make more power overall. It probably couldn't make the same max power, the same peak power, because most Coyotes are going to be making their peak horsepower at 7,500, or at least close to the higher RPM band. That's because, again, horsepower is just a function of torque. And so as you go up in RPM and that's the multiplication factor with torque, it's going to increase your power. Okay, so that's why usually Coyote guys really need to rev out their cars, and a lot of smaller displacement cars, for example, like Hondas, they really need to rev out their cars to get the most out of them.
So let's get into the breakdown of this race. This particular race is a great example because both of these cars have very similar peak powers and probably peak torques, as they are very similar builds. They are both twin turbo 10 speeds. They both have similar boost levels, similar turbos that they use. A lot of that, the weight's similar. There's so many similarities between these two cars. One was built by Midnight Performance, that's going to be the camera car, and the other is a Drowsy Performance build. Both builders are in contact with each other, so they are just, again, both builds are virtually identical, but the outcome of the race was heavily influenced by the power delivery of each car. And the only reason they might have different power delivery is because they have a different boost ramp setup. And so what that boost ramp setup does is it allows the cars to get better traction when they make the power that these cars do. These cars are both 8-second capable, 3-second draggy 60 to 130 cars, so very fast cars. But to do those type of numbers, you have to have good boost management for traction, especially on the street. So I want to highlight the power band on this first race of each car, and then we'll get into what was corrected for the cars after the race. Okay, so just one quick note that I hope you guys noticed. The black car was able to advance about a full car out ahead of the camera car because of differences in power band. The black car is, as you can tell, inherently more efficient from that mile-an-hour range, so from that 60 to 120 range, than the blue car. You'll notice the black car is no longer pulling on the camera car once the race continues, so that means that their peak horsepowers are very similar. Their power bands from, past the 120 mile-an-hour range are very similar, almost identical. But from that lower mile-an-hour, the black car was able to put down more average horsepower for the few gears that it did go through in that range. Okay, so once the race was over, Manuel Gomez of Midnight Performance, he contacted the owner of the camera car, the blue car, and asked him to send him a video. He was very adamant on receiving a video of the race because a video would actually be the best way to determine where the power deficiencies are between the cars, or where the differences are in their car's performance, right? He's not asking for how much power is the other car making, how much horsepower, how much torque, how much the car weighs. He's not asking all those details, because at the end of the day, it's the cumulative sum of all those details that will create the outcome of the race. And the video will show where there are differences in power delivery. Okay, so again, as we discussed earlier, the lower range of the roll from 60 to 120 was where the difference was made. Up top, it was virtually identical. So Manuel Gomez knows that to address that issue, he has to make some changes in the lower RPM, or in the lower band of the race, right? So from that 60 to 120 range. And so that's what he addresses here in the post-race discussion.
I bet we don't have it any higher than you got yours.
What do you have it at? Well, down low you do.
Okay, so now after watching the second race, I hope that it's clear that the differences between the cars in the lower mile-an-hour range from that 60 to 120 range was improved upon once the boost curve was addressed in the camera car. So the deficiencies that it had initially, with it not delivering quite as much power as the other car in the initial part of the race, were addressed. And so Manuel Gomez, most likely by raising the boost maybe just a pound or two in the lower band of the race, so from that 60 to 120 range, was able to overcome that difference between the cars. And as you can see here, both cars were virtually identical from 60 to 160. This is because someone with so much racing experience like Manny really understands how to manage power and how to optimize the power curves of the cars. So if you understand those fundamental aspects of horsepower and torque, and how you can optimize each gear's power band to output the most average horsepower on the street, then you'll get the most out of your car.